Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us here at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy for this panel focused on the implications of military strikes against Iran. To set the table, we've seen significant advancements and developments in Iran policy by the Trump administration even before the first 100 days. An executive order reconstituting the maximum pressure campaign of economic pressure on Iran, public statements on both preparedness to use military force and a desire to negotiate, and an exchange of letters between the supreme leader of Iran and President Trump. This is all, of course, against the backdrop of a view from Washington about the significant setbacks against Iran since the Hamas October 7th attacks on Israel, that the regime today is more exposed than ever before because of the collapse of its threat network, because of successive rounds of strikes inside of Iran, because of the damage to Iran's strategic air defense and other elements of its programs inside Iran. There's a view here in Washington and certainly in Israel that the clock is ticking on military action. So to dive deep and explore the different angles of these considerations here in Washington, we have three experts from the Washington Institute here to discuss these issues today. Richard Nephew is an adjunct fellow at the Washington Institute and a senior research scholar and adjunct professor at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy. He recently departed the U.S. government after serving in a variety of capacities, to include the inaugural U.S. coordinator on global anti-corruption at the State Department, the deputy special envoy for Iran, the principal deputy coordinator for sanctions policy at the State Department, and also the director for Iran at the National Security Council. Mike Eisenstadt is the Kahn Senior Fellow and the director of the Washington Institute's Military and Security Studies program. Mr. Eisenstadt served more than 26 years as an officer in the U.S. Army and in the U.S. Army Reserve before retiring in 2010, including several deployments across the Middle East. And Holly Dagres is the Libitsky Family Senior Fellow in the Washington Institute's Viterbi program on Iran and U.S. policy. Holly also curates The Iranist, a widely read weekly newsletter on Iran. Her groundbreaking report, Iranians on Social Media, and her TEDx talk on the topic have established her as a leading voice on Iranian social movements and generational change. Before we get into the issues before us today, a few housekeeping notes. I have a series of questions for our expert panel today, but if you would like to ask questions, please enter them into the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you are watching this policy forum on our website or on YouTube, feel free to email your questions to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. Again, policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. With that, it's my pleasure to welcome you all today, and let's get into it. Richard, I'd like to start the discussion by asking you to set the table with respect to the status of Iran's nuclear program. The Iran nuclear deal, or JCPOA, imposed constraints on the program in return for some sanctions relief. But after 2019 and Washington's withdrawal from that agreement, Tehran has continued to advance its program. What do we know about how close Iran is to developing a nuclear weapon capability? And if they decide to cross the nuclear threshold, would we know, and how much time would we have to react? I'm going to ask you a second set of questions, which is, one of the Trump administration's earliest foreign policy actions was to restore the economic coercion through the maximum pressure campaign. And the executive order announced objectives, identifying problematic actions from the nuclear program to the ballistic missiles and to the terrorist network. So how do you anticipate Iran's economy and leaders will respond as new batches of sanctions come online? And what are the prospects for Iranian leaders to be ready to negotiate on all of these issues this year?
Great. Thanks very much. And thanks for everybody for joining us. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today. I think the first one, frankly, the answers are a little bit depressing, but I think we do have some sense of where we stand. Iran's nuclear program is very close to being able to produce weapons. There are two major components of a weapons program, the material and the weaponization side. And on the material side, there have been a number of developments that are all to the bad if you want to try and prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons over the course of the last 7 years. Former Secretary of State Tony Blinken said the timetable for Iran to produce its first weapons worth of highly enriched uranium was 6 to 7 days. Frankly, that timeline could even be a little bit shorter at this point. But it really comes down to two main factors: Iran's production and stockpile of 60% enriched uranium and Iran's advanced centrifuge capabilities. At this point, they have enough material that the real factor of interest in understanding the time requirement is the efficiency of Iran's centrifuges. These have improved significantly since Donald Trump decided to withdraw from the JCPOA in 2018. And while estimates of these improvements vary, basically people have estimated them to be roughly 3 times as efficient as the original model that we were dealing with under the JCPOA. So as a result of all this, Iran has well more enough of advanced centrifuges to do the job at its known facilities and quite quickly. But those facilities are vulnerable to attack and importantly are also subject to IAEA inspections, which gets to the point about how quickly we might detect a decision to go to weapons. Assuming inspectors are allowed to do their jobs, they would detect a decision by Iran to ramp up its enrichment operations to 90% enriched uranium pretty quickly. 90% enriched uranium is what we believe Iran is aiming for if it were trying to have weapons. Basically, 90% is just a more, it's more enriched. It is certainly a more distilled version of the amount of uranium that Iran already has on hand. And they have, again, well more enough. Inspectors are not present at these sites 24/7, but Iran has accepted increased visits, and the IAEA is well aware of the timelines that Iran can operate on to try and break out. So I think we can assume, for the sake of argument, that the IAEA can get there at least once in a 6 to 7 day period. And that gives Iran a lot of time, though, to be able to operate, not a whole lot of time for everyone else. Say there's a snowstorm or a traffic accident or something similar. So when we're talking about less than a week, Iran actually has a lot of flexibility to try and move out. And of course, all this assumes that Iran tries to enrich uranium further at the declared sites. And there's no reason to assume that. Iran could try and move that material to a secret location where they could potentially try and enrich it further. And Iran has produced many more centrifuges than we can take account of since 2021, when they decided to stop implementing some of the transparency provisions that were contained in the JCPOA. Now, getting back to the issue of weaponization, does this mean they could have a nuclear weapon in 6 to 7 days? No. Weapons work is something that would have to go on top of the enrichment of uranium further. Warhead for a missile would take probably longer, and something else, something much more crude, could be done much more quickly than that. There were press reports recently that indicate Iran was even willing to, or looking into and interested in, a more crude device that could potentially be produced quite quickly. And again, if the material has been moved, it'd be much more difficult for the IAEA or anyone else to detect it before Iran was standing at the threshold. So with that, I think we move on to sanctions, and part of the strategy trying to address this problem. Look, sanctions cannot prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. At this moment, and as it's been since 2007, the decision about whether or not Iran is going to get nuclear weapons ultimately comes down to whether or not Iran's leaders decide to move in that direction. And sanctions at this point are not about trying to stop Iran from crossing any fundamental technical barriers. It is about trying to create pressure on the system so that they choose not to go down that path. Iran's reduced these barriers and has reduced all the technical elements that would give us time for sanctions to really try and influence the Iranian decision-making on this point. But it is one of the major tools that we have, and it's one that the Trump administration has decided to push forward. So I think with that, 2 points that I would offer on sanctions. First, I think we need to remember what max pressure is and what it means. Essentially, today, it just means enforcing existing sanctions as vigorously as possible. The Biden administration did not formally relax any sanctions, even if they didn't press as hard as they might. And there are no actual sanctions to restore. And they're pretty comprehensive at this point. Second, there have been many more months of max pressure than there were of the JCPOA, actually. The JCPOA was essentially going concern from January 2016 until May of 2018. And I'm bad at math, but that's about 28 months. even given time for a setup of max pressure back then, you're basically still looking at 36 months of max pressure in that time. And that's even without including the Biden administration or some of the impacts of COVID. And so all this basically means is max pressure is something that the Iranians at this point are used to. They have an understanding of what that potentially could do. That doesn't mean that Iran is invulnerable to pressure. And I think the Iranians are feeling significant economic problems at this point. We can see this in their electricity usage. We can see this in some of the blackouts they've had to absorb. But the reality is also the Iranians have demonstrated a willingness to absorb a considerable economic pain. And they've been able to adapt to a lot of what we've been able to throw at them. And I think that brings us to a real inflection point that we face about how we would try and ratchet up pressure on the Iranians directly. Essentially, it comes down to pressuring the Chinese to stop buying Iranian oil or to stop Iranian oil from getting to China. You could imagine a deal with the Chinese that would address the former. You could certainly imagine steps that would try and preclude oil from getting to China, including there's been discussion recently about using the U.S. military and other forces. But it really does come back to a question of why you would do this and whether or not it actually convinces the Iranians to negotiate. They could, and they could try and work out a deal. And I think we should talk later about what would look like in a deal. But I do think that there's also quite a significant risk of escalation coming from that. And we should remember that the Iranians said very clearly back in the first Trump administration that their response to not being able to sell oil would be to make sure that no one else can either. So it is definitely not a low risk maneuver to try and increase the pressure on Iranians at this point.
Thanks so much for laying all of that out and setting the table. So Richard spoke about both the efficacy of a max pressure campaign, what it can accomplish, what you have to be prepared to do in order to enforce it, and also just how close Iran is and the different technical advancements and decisions that have been made so that should a political decision be made, they can move out very fast. Which brings us to Mike. You recently published a long paper, and congratulations on that, analyzing the efficacy of preventive action against Iran's nuclear program. President Trump, as recently as a few days ago, issued a warning to Tehran about his readiness to use military action should Iran's destabilizing activities continue. Can you walk us through your paper, the considerations for military action? What would the objective be? What are the challenges that a military strike would need to overcome? And would military strikes catalyze or paralyze Iran's pursuit of the bomb?
Thank you very much, Dana. And I'll just say the name of the paper is Attacking Iran's Nuclear Program, the Complex Calculus of Preventive Action. It's available on our website now. I just want to make it clear also that I did not take a position in writing this paper, either pro or con. This is one of those issues that I believe that unless you have access to the intelligence that the planners and policymakers have, and unless you know that the capabilities that they have at their disposal, you cannot do a credible net assessment of whether preventive action makes sense or not. That said, I thought it was still useful to go down kind of analytically and try to assess what are the main challenges that a military strike would have to surmount in order to be considered successful. The first thing I'll say is that looking at this from Israel's experience, Israel, and I don't assume that Israel will act unilaterally, although I think that's quite possible, or Israel might act with the US. But either way, I think, any decision to strike will be based on kind of an understanding that twice Israel has struck against nuclear programs in the region, against Iraq in 1981 and against Syria in 2007. And in both cases, they were able to buy time so that totally unforeseeable and unpredictable events could derail efforts by Iraq and Syria to reconstitute their program in the aftermath. So the goal, I think, of any strike would be to disrupt and delay efforts to build a bomb and to buy time for other things to happen in order to further delay or disrupt Iran's nuclear program. And I'll say it's also important that you consciously act to use the time that you've bought in order to create regional and global frameworks or contexts that make it less likely for Iran to move forward. The second thing I just want to say is that preventive action is not a one-off event, but a prolonged campaign, because Iran will almost certainly try to rebuild using residual capabilities that are likely to survive a strike. You have stockpiles of high-enriched uranium, not all of which might be destroyed. You have very large numbers of centrifuges, almost 20,000 right now, 17,000 of which are operating. Not all of them are likely to be destroyed, and not all key personnel are likely to be killed in a strike. So Iran is likely to have at least the basis for kind of rebuilding or reconstituting its program. Also, if you look at recent Israeli military operations, they were able to take out 80% of Hezbollah's missiles, according to the former defense minister, Yoav Gallant. And if they had struck earlier, they could have gotten 90%. And likewise, when they struck in October against Parchin, where you had solid fuel missile production facility, they were able to reduce production by 90%. So those are pretty amazing attrition rates by historical standards. But if you look at it in the context of Iran's nuclear program, if you were to reduce its stockpile of enriched uranium by 80 or 90%, you're still talking about having 2 or 3 bombs worth of high enriched uranium on hand at the end of the day. So what you need is follow-on activities, most likely covert action, backstop by the threat of subsequent military strikes in order to further disrupt and delay Iran's efforts to rebuild. And likewise, it's likely that these covert actions will be at a faster pace and a higher level of intensity than past covert action that Israel attempted in order to disrupt Iran's nuclear program. So what they would try to accomplish, I suspect, is military covert synergies, and that the impact of increased covert action and military restrikes makes it difficult for Iran to rebuild, and also the threat of more broad strikes, not just against the nuclear program, but perhaps against conventional military facilities, against economic targets, and against leadership targets, might also give Iran pause or cause them to act very slowly and carefully in their efforts to rebuild. Also, I think it's important that if there is a strike, that it be done in a way that creates an environment that is conducive to restrikes. So the most important thing is that my belief is that in life, nothing succeeds like success. So if you're able to say that if the Israelis or the US government can say that the first strike accomplished significant results, set back the program significantly, and that it'll take Iran a long time to rebuild, it makes it easier to argue for restrikes in the future because, again, you're building on a record of success. You also want to avoid escalation so that Iran will want to probably respond in a way that makes the experience of preventive action so painful that Israel and or the United States will not want to do this again. But they have limited options at this point because of the strikes that were done that limited their ability to produce more solid fuel missiles. Every time they strike, they lose a significant part of their strategic missile force. They have limited options in the Gulf if they disrupt traffic, the shipment of oil from the Gulf. That has a potential to create a backlash against Iran internationally because there's increased oil prices and the like. So there's limits in terms of what Iran can do. And plus, if the US acts in a way that makes it clear that there is no daylight between Israel and the United States, Iran will not want to take on both Israel and the United States, and that makes it less likely for it to escalate. And likewise, they might also be less willing to do damage against America's Gulf allies, that holds out the possibility of US getting involved. And then finally, what we'd want to minimize civilian casualties, but I don't think that's a major problem because most of the nuclear facilities are many miles from, in most cases, many miles from urban centers. And anyhow, if you're hitting enrichment facilities, it's more like an industrial accident involving corrosive materials. These are buried facilities, so it's more likely they'll be contained and that you won't have the escape of large amounts of corrosive material. And anyhow, if it gets carried by the wind, it'll diffuse after a few miles. So again, it's not the same thing as hitting a nuclear reactor, this kind of strike. Finally, I mentioned something about what you do with the time gained. That's very important that whoever does a strike has a plan for how to use the time. And I think the goal will be to shape Tehran's proliferation calculus so that they continue with a hedging approach. They do not decide that as a result of the strike, they want to actually get the weapon. And then you could also hold out the threat of subsequent strikes, like I said before, that are broader and perhaps more damaging to the regime in their scope in order to deter them. So I think actually there are ways that potentially a preventive strike can be managed to make it more effective. But again, whenever you use military force, you're entering the realm of the unknown, and there's always a potential for unforeseen circumstances to occur, and you never know how things end up despite your best efforts. Anyhow, thank you.
Thanks for that. So a lot of unknowns, but the goal would be to disrupt and delay. And we talked about, you covered, and by time, the ways in which Iran's nuclear program and the potential strikes against it would be very different from the Iraq or the Syria contexts. So Holly, the recent flurry of activity centered on Iran is now everyday front page news. Exchanges of letters, mutual issuing of threats and recriminations, and of course, threats of broad military action. It's shaping the environment around a potential opening for direct or indirect negotiations, which of course is President Trump's preference, as he said very clearly. So what do you see as the likely impact of a diplomatic path versus a military strike, especially given all the considerations that Mike has laid out, on Iranian politics and Iranian society? And how could we think through whether either diplomacy or a military strike could increase or decrease popular support for the regime?
Well, first, thank you for having me on this timely panel. I should start by saying that my information is based on my conversations with Iranians on the ground and open source intelligence. Historically, there's always been a sentiment that Iranians would rally around the flag of nationalism in the event of an attack on the country's controversial nuclear program. When I was actually in Iran in 2006, living there when then President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad announced that Iran was enriching uranium, and nationalism was at an all-time high. You'd go to the bazaar and buy pomegranate juice, and it was called nuclear juice. People were chanting the mantra of nuclear energy is our inherent right. And while that was once an accurate assumption, particularly in the lead up to the sign up of the JCPOA in 2015, it was because a lot of Iranians at the time believed that their economic isolation and suffering was because of the West, particularly the United States. So now that sentiment has actually shifted towards the regime. And there's a sense on the ground that the regime is the reason for all their problems. And so with that in mind, I think you can see a correlation between rising anti-regime sentiment and dwindling support for the country's nuclear program. It's hard to pinpoint where that exactly began, but arguably it started taking shape after the December 2017, January 2018 protests, which were the largest in terms of geography since the 1979 revolution at the time. And of course, anti-regime protests came to head in 2022 with the Women Life Freedom Uprising. So now there's an entire generation of Iranians that have lived under, back then it was a multilateral sanctions regime under the Obama administration, and now a unilateral one since the Trump administration has reimposed it, and effectively tied to the country's nuclear program. And so when you talk to a lot of Iranians today, there's a sense of, what did this get us other than isolation and a deteriorating economy? So, for example, Mortaza was 18 when the negotiations over the nuclear program began. He's now in his late 30s, and he said to a journalist, after 18 years, this nuclear program has had one thing for me: the loss of my youth. Enough is enough. On the other side of the spectrum, of course, some pro-regime supporters argue that the Islamic Republic should actually go all the way with its nuclear program, because the country, despite abiding by a nuclear deal, the US withdrew under the Donald Trump administration and reimposed sanctions. So they've made jokes along the lines of, well, they've sanctioned everyone but me and my uncle, so why not go all the way? And so the thinking there is that it's out of spite and defiance that they believe that developing a nuclear weapon is actually the right way to go because they can stand up to the West, specifically the United States and Israel. But given the dire economic situation on the ground, you won't find that argument made by all supporters of the regime. For instance, when Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei criticized nuclear talks just earlier this year, Zahra saw that a conservative Iranian addressed the Supreme Leader in a viral post on X. And so she said, Mr. Khamenei, I don't want to resist anymore. I'm hopeless. I'm tired. I'm broken down, been crushed under the weight of the psychological and economic pressures. So when Zahra is talking about resistance, she's referring to this idea of a resistance economy, a phrase that Khamenei actually coined himself, which is that the Islamic Republic is circumventing sanctions by making the Iranian economy less dependent on international trade. So they do that through a trade with neighbors potentially, but more so that they're actually focusing on developing things domestically and smuggling things from neighboring countries. So the comments that Sadat made actually echoes the sentiment found among some Iranians that hope to get some sort of economic reprieve through sanctions relief. But and just to give you a sense about the dire economic situation on the ground just in the past few months, of course, there was talks of power outages. That's been very consistent throughout the country. 21 provinces out of 31 have been experiencing that. The Iranian rial has lost half of its worth in the past eight months, and we've seen actually the price of potatoes skyrocket to 217% in the Iranian calendar year, which is coming to an end on Thursday for the spring equinox or Nowruz. So I would argue that you're just not really seeing the same appetite amongst Iranians for a nuclear deal as they were in 2015. At the time when that was signed, a lot of Iranians took to the streets to celebrate as if they had won the World Cup. They were really happy because they still actually believed in reform and hoped that the deal would bring the country outside from the cold, and that their living situations would improve. But given the events of the past few years, Iranians can't see any way out of that. And so that sense of hope and change through economic reprieve has mostly gone with the exception of what you see from some pro-regime Iranians. And what may be surprising to many to hear is that a lot of Iranians, anti-regime ones, that is, actually don't want a deal to happen because they believe if the Trump administration was to make a deal and was to give them sanctions relief, they would be giving a lifeline to a regime that they no longer want and have been consistently calling for their ouster since 2022.
Thanks. So a much more muddled picture when it comes to regime popularity, dwindling support for the nuclear program, dwindling support for the resistance economy, and attitudes towards what diplomacy or sanctions relief can actually provide either for the Iranian people versus for the regime. Very mixed picture. Okay. Mike, we're going to go back to you. A lot of Holly's commentary was about Iranian views of the West monolithically, and within that, both the United States and Israel lumped together. But of course, two separate entities, and there's layers in the policy debate here about the United States and Israel acting together versus what independent decisions and thinking and planning might be either in Israel or here. So obviously, Israel's willingness to carry out military strikes against Iran is a major area of discussion. You spent time in your paper thinking through this. Can you talk now about what Israel could achieve with military action on its own against Iran versus acting together with the United States?
Yeah. Yeah. First of all, let me just say I have no doubt that unless the U.S. is pulled away by a crisis elsewhere in the world, and I'll get back to this in my closing comment, I think at the very least, the United States will be involved, as it was last year in April and in October, in providing assistance to Israeli efforts to defend itself against Iran's response, at the very least. And certainly, I have to believe there'll be kind of cooperation with regard to intelligence sharing and the like, at the very least. Now, in terms of Israeli capabilities, first of all, I have to assume that, and I will say, there's no single silver bullet to this kind of operation. First of all, you have different types of target sets. You have fuel that is kept in large canisters at various places. You have enrichment facilities, which are increasingly going underground. And then you have personnel. And each of these targets requires a different targeteering approach and different planning considerations. Okay. And I suspect that the Israelis, and probably us as well, have developed highly classified capabilities over the last 30 years, specifically for such a contingency. And I would just note that a few months ago, the former foreign minister of Iran, Mohammad Zarif, mentioned that in the past, the Iranians had discovered that the Israelis had put explosives in the bases of gas centrifuges. And it's possible that was actually kind of explaining what happened in, I think, 2021, when there was an explosion in Natanz. And it may have been because of explosives in the base of the centrifuges. So the Israelis have also used drones in their attacks in Iran. And this report of a remote control ambush of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. So I have to believe that they've developed capabilities that, are very creative, similar to the walkie-talkie and pager attack that they conducted against Hezbollah in September 2024, though, of course, kind of tailored towards industrial targets. And therefore, I think it's a fool's errand to try to figure out how Israel will try to do it. I will also note that even when using conventional means against, say, Hassan Nasrallah in the strike that killed him, my understanding is he was not killed by the blast effects of the bombs, but he asphyxiated, that he was still alive after the strike, and he died through asphyxiation as a result of the byproducts of the explosives. So there might be unconventional means of using conventional weapons such as high explosive bombs and penetrator bombs to achieve effects against Iran's nuclear program that are not the first order effects that people necessarily normally think about when thinking about these things. Of course, there's the US GBU 57 MOP, massive ordnance penetrator, which is a 30,000-pound bomb, which is developed, intentionally to deal with the Fordo problem, the deeply buried enrichment facility in Iran. Of course, it's only carried by the B-2 bomber, and the U.S. has only about 19 B-2s. And it's, there's been some of our colleagues have, floated the idea of the United States kind of loaning Israel some B-2s. I don't know if that's on the table, if that's likely to happen. I'm not sure also that this is necessary. Again, I'm not saying it is or it isn't. There might be other ways to get at Fordo and other deeply buried targets. But certainly it would be useful to have that as part of your toolkit in dealing with this problem. Let me also say that even if you can't get at the enrichment facilities or the stocks of uranium, enriched uranium to the degree that you would like, if you succeed in destroying the weaponization facilities, well, in the end of the day, they still have their enriched uranium and they have the ability to enrich, but they don't have the ability to weaponize. So that buys you more time. And those kind of targets, actually, the Israeli strike last October supposedly hit a site, Talakhan 2, at Parchin, which was supposedly, or at least the Israelis believed, engaged in weapons research and development activities. And if those rely on pieces of equipment that are very hard to replace, you can buy quite a bit of time, even if other aspects of the strike aren't very successful. The Israelis, by hitting Parchin last October, were able to set back the missile program by a year or two, according to Israeli estimates. So there are things you could do, even if it's not successful writ large. You can actually achieve success by hitting very, very select parts of the program. I mentioned before that a preventive strategy necessitates a prolonged campaign. And planners will have to ask themselves, are the existing architectures for both intelligence collection, you need really exquisite intelligence in order to succeed in this type of operation. Are the existing intelligence architectures for collection, for targeting, and for covert action sufficiently robust and resilient that they can be sustained for years on end. Now, the Israelis have had remarkable success in acting time and again against the Iranians, despite the fact that this is undoubtedly a very high priority for the Iranians to get at to figure out how their system is penetrated, who's spying, how the Israelis are finding out what they are finding out. And yet Israel can do it again and again. So it seems until now, their architecture has been very robust. The question is, will that continue towards the future? Secondly, will the geopolitical environment remain conducive to follow-on strikes? Covert action is not geopolitically disruptive. I have no doubt if the Israelis have the ability to do it, they will do it. But we've learned from a past experience, is that covert action only gets you so far. It takes a lot of effort and a lot of time to plan each action. You probably want to have only a limited footprint for these kind of things, because more people you have on the ground, the greater the risk of getting caught. So it enables you to disrupt adversary efforts, but in the end, you have to backstop covert action with military strikes. And again, will the geopolitical environment be conducive to that? My final point is this, and this is something I'm also very concerned about, not just with regard to Israel and preventive action against Iran, but writ large. I worry that we're in an October 6th moment for the United States. Like Israel, for the 9 or 10 months before October 7th, was engaged in extremely disruptive culture wars and political conflicts with regard to judicial reform and stuff like that, which helped convince Hamas that Israel was vulnerable to attack. And I worry now that with the focus in Washington today about efforts by the Trump administration to reduce the federal workforce, there are our own culture wars, and questions about America's alliance commitments, our enemies might see this as an ideal time to strike, whether it be in the Straits of Taiwan or in the Korean Peninsula or perhaps elsewhere. Keep in mind, in Israel, they thought the attack would come from the north, and it came from Gaza. So maybe an attack on American interest comes from an unexpected direction. But I worry that our focus on our internal politics and our culture wars and political polarization here will convince our enemies that now is the time to strike, not 2027, as people have been talking about for China, and that this will have a major impact on our ability both to deal with Iran's nuclear program, as well as a host of other threats that the United States is facing now.
Thanks for that very depressing ending to the question. Okay, Holly, what I want to talk about now is the objective of pressure as we think through military strikes, diplomacy, economic pressure. So there's often been debate about, is the objective of certain actions regime change or to change actions of the regime? So as we hear certain rhetoric now from Washington, the language in the executive order, for example, talks about the nuclear program and support for terrorism. But there's, of course, been thinking before, former Secretary of State Pompeo's 12 points. If you put the 12 points together, it's really changing the regime. So can you talk to us about your assessment of whether military strikes would then lead to generalized unrest, which could produce internal domestic pressure on the regime or regime change? And you talked a little bit about how frustrated and exhausted the Iranian people are by the kinds of pressures they felt now for a generation. And you talked about shifting attitudes where this is now the blame is placed on the regime as opposed to the West. But can you take us down just a little bit more granularity on the appetite for political change in Iran? And recently, the United States has pulled back on some support for programs that have supported human rights, the free flow of information. Do you see any of this as having an impact on whether or not those that would want regime change actually have the tools or resources to do it?
Sure. Well, after the 2022 Women Life Freedom movement didn't succeed, in part because actually Iranians think the international community didn't support them, particularly the West, in their quest for freedom, and the collapse of the short-lived Georgetown 8 opposition coalition, there was a real sense of hopelessness amongst Iranians for change. That was it. They weren't going to see it happen anymore. Then the fall of Bashar al-Assad happened in December, and suddenly that hope that was lost was invigorated. Some Iranians started thinking that maybe in their lifetime they might see the Islamic Republic gone. I should caveat that these individuals aren't advocating for a bloody civil war like in Syria, but merely envisioning that if Assad could be ousted, maybe Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei could as well. So even though arguably the situations in the respective countries are very different, seeing that happen in Syria has changed some of the conversations and thinking on the ground. How that would happen, of course, is a separate discussion in its own. As I noted earlier, anti-regime sentiment is at an all-time high, and it's just continuing on an upward trend. And those embers of anger that could spread like a wildfire are very much there. We've seen this consistently since December 2017 onwards, these nationwide anti-regime protests, and I don't think we've seen the last of them. And partly because in our eyes, they're not making headlines, but just to give you a sample, for the Islamic Republic's 46th year anniversary, there was a nearly week-long protest in the southwestern city of Dagres. And Iranians were chanting, "Death to the dictator, death to the Islamic Republic." And this year is the year of blood. Sayyid Ali Khamenei must be overthrown. And these were popular chants we've been hearing throughout the past several years. So I would assess that nationwide anti-regime protests are certainly on the horizon, but what that trigger could be is anyone's guess. And it's evident that the clerical establishment is very worried about that. For instance, that's why authorities paused the full implementation of the draconian hijab and chastity bill and is now reportedly releasing the leaders of the Green Movement after 14 years of house arrest. So these are really band-aids on issues because systemic mismanagement, corruption, and repression persist and have only grown. Taking this back now to how Iranians would respond to strikes on the country's nuclear program, we actually do have two data points. The April and October 2024 tit for tats between Iran and Israel, and how ordinary Iranians reacted to those events. So some Iranians, mostly older ones, were worried about a repeat of the bloody Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. There were viral videos and reports of Iranians stocking up on food and medicines, as well as long lines at gas stations to fill up their cars with gas. There wasn't any pouring into the streets in response to the events, though when Iran launched its attacks, we did see that they had organized pro-regime rallies in various cities. Interestingly, authorities did announce the arrest of anyone who was celebrating the attacks by Israel on social media, which should give you a sense of how some Iranians were reacting to Israel's response. There was also a viral hashtag that was shared by Iranians, including the family of those killed and the victims of the Islamic Republic's repression. And the hashtag was Jang kheli tarsnak ast. War is very scary. But the caveat was that the Islamic Republic had been at war with its people for 4 decades. So just imagine how bad some Iranians feel about living under this repressive regime, that's the correlation they're making. And I should note that this is a sentiment mostly shared by young Iranians, Gen Zers, who weren't alive during the Iran-Iraq War and haven't lived through the war of cities like their parents and grandparents. And case in point of just the diversity of views, rights activist Atina Daimi, who has recently moved to the West, wrote, "We want freedom, but this freedom will only be achieved when it is realized from the hearts of the Iranian people and without the interference of foreign forces, not on the ruins caused by war." And there was also some really interesting commentary from graffiti that was seen across the country. Someone wrote, "Next time, hit them harder, Israel. They're scared." Of course, this is a very polite version of what was written. Another wrote, Israel hit. They don't have the guts to do revenge. I should note that these Iranians aren't warmongers. Rather, they see that if the Islamic Republic does decide to go for a bomb, it means the death knell for any change because regimes that have nuclear weapons tend to remain in power. And then there was also the enemy of my enemy is not my friend, referring to Israel. And we are not free until all of us are free. Free Palestine, free Iran. And so you can really see from these examples that Iran is not a monolith, but we can pick up on certain trends that give us a baseline of what to expect in the event of an attack. And just to circle back to human rights for a second, I think it's noteworthy that whenever there are big international events, the Islamic Republic actually uses them as a cover to crack down further on society. And of course, the people that will be bearing the brunt the most are women and girls, ethnic and religious minorities. So if there is an attack, I would expect it to be no different. That repression will be definitely on the rise. And unfortunately, this pulling back of US support of human rights and the free flow of information, as I also noted in my recent policy watch, is that it inadvertently serves the interests of the Islamic Republic and prevents us from having those eyes on the ground, as evident by some of the comments I've made.
Thanks so much for that. Okay, so we've spent a lot of time on the status of Iran's nuclear program, on what military action could or could not actually achieve, that reactions inside Iran are actually quite ambiguous and a mixed bag. Less debate, at least here in Washington, about the content of a deal. Should there be a deal to be had? So, Richard, I'd like to turn to you and ask us to lay out if there were to be a negotiation on Iran's nuclear program today, very different context from the pre-2015 context. So talk to us about what the objective of a deal would be at this point and the core elements that we should be focusing on to assess the strength or the weakness of a negotiated settlement, should there be one.
Great. And this question is a lot less depressing, not least because I still think that a negotiated, verifiable agreement is the most durable, sustainable solution to the Iran nuclear issue, as it has been. It's just really a question of whether or not we can get there. I do think there are a couple of facts that we need to account for before I really get into the details. First, I approach this question and this discussion with an expectation that unless the United States is able to truly drive Iran's economy into a multi-year crash or incapacitate its nuclear program, we're negotiating on something that's less comprehensive than the JCPOA, much less the go to zero approach that has been advocated for. And this goes to a fundamental question about whether or not the Iranians are right now in a mental state where they'd be prepared to capitulate in the nuclear program. I don't see any reason why anyone should believe that to be the case. And I'm aware of press reports that the president's recent letter to Iran indicated a 2-month timeline for conclusion of negotiations. The 2-month timeline is highly unlikely to be a long enough time to convince the Iranians that the United States is in it to bring the program to zero, or to drive it to zero. And of course, we also have a caveat here that if we do try and bring Iran's economy to a crash, they are 6 to 7 days from having a weapons worth of HU that they could divert to weapons. So their nuclear breakout options are quite real. Second, and based on that, you're not going to regain what has been lost in the JCPOA. Iran's technical progress has mooted elements of the JCPOA that dealt with centrifuge research and development, for instance. They've built new sites that are harder to attack. They've learned how to work with 60% enriched uranium. They have centrifuges that are probably hidden. We've lost things. These are not things we're going to be able to recapitulate in a serious way through any kind of new deal. Third, we might have some amounts of leverage, and again, depending on what we're able to bring to bear, but the international system has also changed. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of a very different world that we were operating with in 2013. Set aside conflicts between the United States and its allies. What Russia and China will think and how they'll operate will be different now, and how they'll play with Iran will be different as well. And I think it's worth considering and thinking more deeply about what the Russian-Iranian relationship is in particular after the war in Ukraine. So starting with those caveats and assuming that we have something less comprehensive than the JCPOA, we still potentially could have a deal that is quite useful and addresses core elements of the nuclear program and gives us confidence that Iran will not cross the threshold of weapons. Key elements could include intensified transparency steps and providing access to IEA and international inspectors that would allow them to provide confidence that Iran is not moving to break out. Verification on weaponization-related technologies and making sure that the Iranians are not able to play with weaponization in some other sorts of spaces with a lot more intrusive access than was provided for under the original JCPOA. Limits on uranium enrichment levels and stocks, which again is similar to what we had in the JCPOA, but will have to be crafted based on the technical realities of the program. Perhaps limits on the number of centrifuges that Iran has, and certainly more access to the stocks of inventories that they've got. A permanent ban on the plutonium path to nuclear weapons, which effectively Iran hasn't worked on since the 1990s. There's no reason why you couldn't have that locked in, especially by making sure that the Iraq reactor is not in a position to produce plutonium, and Iran can't do anything with plutonium that comes out of it. And then lastly, something dealing with missile proliferation and drone proliferation, which I think the experience in and around October 7th and subsequent has really demonstrated the seriousness, not only from a nuclear perspective, but also just from a general regional stability sort of perspective. Now, that list of things is still actually quite extensive, and there are a number of pieces in there that would be of high value. And if we're assuming that we're approaching this through negotiations, that means that the Iranians are going to ask for something in return, and that's going to come with a bill of sanctions relief. Functionally, I think you've got two options. Option one is the same sort of approach we took with the JCPOA, which is a limited package of steps that are primarily about foreign companies being able to operate with Iran. That would provide the United States leverage to deal with regional sorts of issues. It would allow the U.S. to maintain its position of pressure on Iran for its regional behaviors and similar. The second option, though, and it's one that is potentially more available to Trump than it ever was to Obama, is something much bigger. Something that includes even elements of the U.S. embargo and providing access to the U.S. economy. Now, this might strike some as heretical, and there are good reasons why we would not want this to be the case. But if put in the context of a broader deal on regional issues or part of a process that would allow the United States to prevent the reconstitution of Iran's proxies, it may be something that's worth doing. And of course, under Trump, we have a much different political situation in facing U.S. Congress and other forces who may be inclined to oppose any kind of deal that would offer significant source of sanctions relief. In fact, one of the things that Donald Trump said during his initial campaign for office is that he thought the JCPOA was a bad deal because it did not provide access for the U.S. economy inside of Iran. It may be something that he thinks is quite attractive. It certainly was part of the package that he offered to Kim Jong-un with North Korea. But here again, I think the issue will come back to how far you're able to get on regional policy issues and whether or not you're able to get to the Iranians to make commitments addressing the regional circumstance, which frankly, I think is going to be very difficult to achieve. Which brings me back to a more fundamental concept of what are we talking about in terms of deal length, duration, those sorts of things. I think we have to remember first principles here. Our objective is to prevent Iran from crossing the nuclear weapons threshold. And so if we can get a deal that is short-term, that provides us with that kind of confidence in exchange for short-term sanctions relief, that to me should count as a win. And here I note that Mike Singh's idea that he's put out several times about renewable 5-year deals, for instance, might be incredibly attractive here as well. And then you could imagine putting on top of that something that's a much more comprehensive approach involving regional actors and others that would address some of these broader sorts of challenges, but having addressed the nuclear issue in the first instance.
Thanks so much for that. We are going to end this promptly on time. So what I'm going to do is invite each of you, starting with Holly and working this way, for any concluding remarks that you'd like to share. But I'm going to ask that you think about, it seems that a lot of timelines are cued to 2025 as the critical year. There's an expiring Security Council resolution in October that brought into force the original Iran nuclear agreement. There are timelines related to any setbacks that Iran has already experienced as a result of military action last year. There are attempts to rebuild. There are obviously different ceasefires and levels of kinetic action around the region. So when you think through decision making, particularly here in Washington, about debates about using military action for preventive purposes, how much time do you think Iran has to decide whether it's going to accept this offer to negotiate? Is it a couple months? Is it all year? Is it until October? Do you think that this dance will go through this year, past October? Talk to us about timelines.
Well, from my assessments and my conversations with diplomats and our own officials, is that we really don't have much time. And I would say by June, if nuclear talks don't come to head, snapback will happen, and then you might see Iran pull from the NPT treaty, and a lot of events happen. So I think that timeline is very, very short. I was thinking about this the other day. We also didn't have a great timeline during the first year of the Biden administration. And this is also part of the issue of the Trump administration is everybody's still trying to fill roles in government. And so there's only a handful of people that have their hands on the steering wheel to kind of navigate this thing. And that was exactly what happened in the Biden administration. And then the Iranian presidential election happened, and then we got an interesting president at the time and made it a little harder to negotiate. And then Women Life Freedom and a host of other events happened since. So I kind of see some correlations there with that very short timeline, but for different reasons. And so I think that unfortunately things will be coming to head in just the next few months.
Okay, so for Holly, a few months. Mike.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with Holly because first of all, from the Israeli point of view, they have a limited window of opportunity from as they see it. Iran's strategic SAMs have been neutralized for now. They said it'll take Iran maybe a year or so to recuperate. The hardening process, the process of hardening and burying the nuclear program is going apace, and the longer you wait, the harder the problem becomes. And also politically, right now, the supreme leader has generally, although he's an ideological hardliner, he has shown himself to be very risk averse and very cautious decision maker by and large. And once he's gone, you'll have the country will be, first of all, we don't know who will succeed him, but it's likely that people in the IRGC and the Revolutionary Guard will play an even larger role in decision making. We know that there are people there, such as Amir Ali Hajizadeh, the head of the aerospace forces, who are kind of very kind of have an adventurous kind of streak, and are likely to push for a harder line. So for all these reasons, I think earlier is better. But and then in the end, decision makers have to think. I'll say, look, if the goal of prevention is to buy time, and you can buy time through a deal, depending on what the deal is, it might be better. But if you can't get a deal that covers not just nukes but other stuff, then policymakers have to decide whether they can live with Iran as a nuclear threshold state and live with the ever-present possibility of a nuclear breakout, which could conceivably happen very quickly, or whether it's actually better to actually strike militarily, cut down their nuclear capabilities. Now, on the one hand, that might cause them to decide to opt for the bomb if they can get it, but on the other hand, it might put them in a situation where that's not an option anymore. And therefore, it's actually easier to contain them by striking. So, and again, outside the government, without knowing what the targeting information shows, what the capabilities that can be brought to bear are, it's hard to say which one is more desirable. But it's a very difficult decision that policymakers in both Jerusalem and Washington are facing if they can't get a nuclear deal.
So, I'll dissent slightly. But I don't think I fundamentally disagree with my co-panelists here. Look, I've been working on the Iran nuclear issue now for 22 years. And for 22 years, I have long worried about waking up the next morning to an Iranian nuclear test that we didn't see coming, or something that we started seeing coming, but then only saw at the last moment, or something similar. It is a worry I've had for 22 years. In 22 years, I've had 3 children. In 22 years, I bought a lot of houses. Lived a lot of life in 22 years. And a lot has changed in U.S. foreign policy. A lot has changed in what our options are. A lot has changed in our ability to respond to this. And 22 years is an awful lot of time. So set against that, I think that we sometimes compress the timelines in our own heads because we look at the next crisis that's coming, as you pointed to, Dana, with the Security Council resolution, or where Iran's ability is to repair its surface-to-air missile systems to be able to protect itself and similar. And we say, well, now we have to absolutely move. I think we probably have got more time than the next couple of months. But, and this is the important caveat to all this, at some point, we are going to start running out of options, and the options that we have are going to get a lot harder. If we had used military force 15 years ago, the number of nuclear sites we would have had to target would have been a lot less, and they wouldn't have been as deep, and we probably could have done a lot more fundamental damage to the program. If we had used military force a decade ago, probably the same thing, maybe with a little bit more diffusion. So we wouldn't have the same sorts of problems that we have today, even if we would still have problems. And I think that the fundamental answer I come down to is that, do we have to do something about it this year? Maybe not. But if we don't do something about this year, our option set potentially gets smaller, our choices get tighter, our ability to engage in multi-year diplomacy or multi-year sanctions campaigns goes away as well. And I think that lack of optionality is really what's damaging to all this. And of course, we have to, on top of this, as Mike was just saying, that the Iranians get a vote here too. When you think about some of the impediments the Iranians have established for themselves, the U.S. National Intelligence Estimate back in 2007 said it was all up to an option. Political choice made by the Supreme Leader. The Supreme Leader has been operating under a fatwa in which he says we shouldn't have nuclear weapons, but we've not seen that text. We don't know what it says. Descriptions of it indicate that it has optionality if the Islamic Republic is ever threatened. It has the possibility of being amended. And if you put that against the broader swath of Iranian policy, they can change their minds here too. And so we might have that nightmare scenario of a test we didn't see coming. So I think we've got time. I think we've got space, but those options that we used to have gone away. And I think we should expect the same thing going forward.
Well, thank you all so much for unpacking all elements of consideration with respect to preventive action and the prospects of what diplomacy can achieve at this very fraught time of what is clearly a pivotal year with respect to Iran, Iranian decision-making, American decision-making, and Iran's nuclear program. For those of you who have stuck with us through the whole hour, thank you. If you like what you heard, I encourage you to visit the Washington Institute's website. We are consistently putting out products, papers. Our scholars follow these issues inside and out on a daily basis. Richard mentioned, I encourage you to look at Mike Singh's presidential transition paper, laying out a roadmap for diplomacy and retaining credible military options for Iran's nuclear program. Of course, Mike Eisenstadt's paper is also available there, as well as recent analytical pieces by Holly and Richard. Thank you again, and look forward to having you join us for our next policy forum coming up soon.